Today's reading is from the Gospel of Luke. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will put down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God.'" Here ends the reading of the words that give us insight into God. May God grant us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
So the Buddha was not always the Buddha. He was born a prince, Siddhartha Gautama, in what is today Nepal, in the year 563 BCE, before the Common Era. So that's about 5.5 centuries before Jesus was born. Since he was born so long ago and was a prolific religious teacher, there's a lot of myth that surrounds the Buddha, particularly his birth. And like many religious figures, he is described with a divine birth. The story goes like this, that the Buddha's mother, Maya, was dreaming one day, and she dreamt of a white elephant. It's a symbol of good luck. And the white elephant entered her side, and that was the moment of conception. And then the Buddha was born from her side. Siddhartha's mother died a week after giving birth, and he was raised primarily by his aunt. His father was a king, a ruler, and wanted him to live a life that was free from suffering. And so he did everything that he could to ensure that. The first thing was to ensure that he did not leave the palace grounds. And the second thing was to ensure that he had a life of luxury, that he had everything that he needed. And so Siddhartha grew up in a life of extravagance. He got married at a young age, he had a son, and he began to train to be a warrior so that one day he could take his father's place as king. When he was 29 or so, though, he disobeyed his father's orders, and he left the palace grounds for the first time. And he encountered 4 passing sights that changed everything. The first was an elderly man, and he recognized that human beings would all grow old. I hope that's not news to any of you. Then he saw someone who was sick and realized that health is not guaranteed. Then he saw a corpse, and he recognized that all human beings will inevitably die. And then he saw an ascetic, someone who had done away with worldly possessions. But the ascetic, despite being thin and not having anything, seemed to be at peace. And so all of this shook Siddhartha's worldview. And he went back home and fell into a state of deep depression because everything he thought he knew about the world had been shaken. He began to ask existential questions about life. What is the purpose of life? What am I doing here? What should I be doing with my life? And one night, he looked on his sleeping family for the last time, and he got on a horse and rode the horse to the edge of his palace estate. He gave the horse to one of the servants. He took off all of his jewelry, and he cut his long black hair, and he went forth to become an ascetic. In Buddhism, they call this the Great Going Forth. And for 6 years, he lived his life as an ascetic, giving up all worldly possessions. And he went around and studied with various teachers. He learned different types of meditation. He began to talk philosophy, and his main concern was theodicy. That is, why is there suffering in the world? Why is there evil in the world? What is the cause of suffering? He didn't eat much. He didn't drink much. He slept outside. He depended entirely on other people for survival. And at one point, he was eating and drinking as little as humanly possible, and he had so little energy that he fainted and he couldn't get up. A woman saw him and took pity upon him and gave him some food, and he had a realization that living his life as an ascetic had brought him no closer to the answers that he sought. So he had lived life in extravagance, he had lived life with nothing, and neither one was fulfilling to him. And so he started to gravitate not towards either of these paths, but towards the middle path, a path of moderation. And that would become a core tenet of Buddhist teaching. So he decided to live the middle path and saw a Bodhi tree. And he went and he sat down beneath it. And he resolved to sit right there until he had discovered the meaning of life. Some say he sat there for 7 days, a week. Some say he sat there for a week of weeks, 7 times 7 days. 7 is a holy number in many religious traditions. But either way, no matter how long he sat there, everyone agreed that he was tired, he was hungry, he was thirsty, he was in pain, and suffered from self-doubt. But he also began to get in this deeper trance of meditation, a growing state of awareness, as he began to recognize truths about life. He came from a tradition that believed in reincarnation, and so he began to see previous lives. He began to understand the connection between all living things and his life, and he recognized 3 essential things: that there is suffering in life and it's inevitable, that we will all grow old, and that we will all die. But that there is a way to escape the suffering and the cycle of death and rebirth. And in this moment, he had reached enlightenment, nirvana, a place of escape from suffering. And so if you've ever seen this moment depicted in Buddhist paintings, you will see the Buddha sitting underneath the Bodhi tree and touching the ground. Touching the ground is the moment of enlightenment. And Siddhartha changed his name from Siddhartha Gautama, the prince who had given up everything, to Buddha, which means the awakened one. He was awakened to the realities of the world. And so he went out and he began teaching. His first 5 converts were ascetics that he knew, but he went out and spread his teaching far and wide and started to establish communities of monks and nuns. One thing that is uniquely different about Buddha than any of the other religious leaders that we have talked about so far is that Buddha lived into relative old age. 80. I'm not saying that 80 is old. Okay? I'm saying compared to the other religious leaders, he was a lot older. And perhaps this is because He preached moderation of eating. He preached abstaining from drugs and alcohol. He went out into the world and exercised and advocated fresh air and daily meditation. And the way that he died was peaceful as well. He was given some spoiled food accidentally by a well-meaning blacksmith. And Buddha ate it and started to feel sick, but went and gave one last teaching. And his teaching was this to his disciples, that you are a lamp unto yourself. Be true to yourself and depend upon yourself. Look inside for the truth that you need. And he died. We know a lot about the teachings of Buddha, but there are a couple of things that are important to say. One, just like Jesus, the Buddha did not write any of his teachings down. And so they existed as oral tradition for centuries. People told his teachings and then eventually wrote them down. So they may not be exactly what he taught because they existed in that way for a long time. But we do have a lot of writing about the Buddha's teachings. And the second thing is that although he spoke about the things that he knew, that he felt like came from enlightenment, he refused to comment on things that he thought were ultimately unknowable. And he described those things in this way. He said, trying to figure out some of the biggest mysteries in life are a bit like being shot by an arrow, and instead of just pulling the arrow out, sitting there and striving to learn everything that you can about the arrow, trying to describe it before you pull it out, he said you will be sitting there trying to describe and understand it forever, and you will be living in pain. And that's what he thought was true about the mysteries of life, that sometimes there were things that were ultimately unknowable. There are teachings and practices of Buddhism, though, that are essential to the Buddha and becoming a Buddhist. The first is 3 jewels of Buddhism, and I have a slide. Let's look at this. The 3 jewels of Buddhism are the Buddha, relying on the Buddha as the primary teacher. Dharma, compassionate teaching, that is the whole accumulation of Buddha's teaching, using those to help discern your life path. And then Sangha, which is community together, and at least initially meant the community of monks and nuns that the Buddha founded. This leads to 4 noble truths. The 4 noble truths are this. 1, that life is suffering. And whenever the Buddha said that life is suffering, he didn't mean that like every moment was agony. What he meant was that suffering is inherent in a person's life. And that's why I started by telling you the story of Buddha, because it helps you understand why stating that was so important to him. That our lives necessarily involve some form of suffering. I mean, think about how as we grow older, even moments that should be filled with complete joy can also be filled with this bittersweet sense that it's fleeting and will only be here for a moment. And so he said, too, that there is a cause to our suffering. And primarily, the cause to our suffering is attachment. Attachment to people, attachment to places, attachment to materials, cars, houses, money, attachment to things, attachment to expectations about how things ought to be. It is our attachment that leads us to suffering when we lose those things that we are attached to, or things don't go as we expect them to. So the third noble truth is that there is the possibility of ceasing this suffering. Once you understand what causes it, you can stop the suffering. And the way to stop that suffering is by following the Eightfold Path. So let's take a look at the Eightfold Path. I'm not going to go over all of these, but you can see the Eightfold Path is often depicted as a spoked wheel. And so this is one of the most prominent symbols of Buddhism, because this is the way that you reach nirvana, the cessation of suffering, the escape of the cycle of rebirth. And it largely has to do with having the right mental state, acting in the right way towards others, earning a livelihood that does not hurt people, places, or animals. And so it has to do with reforming your life in a way that is set about not suffering yourself and not causing suffering for others. I think one of the most interesting things about Buddhism is that there is some debate, as there is in many Eastern traditions, about whether Buddhism is really a religion or not, or if it is just a method of meaning-making in life, which I suppose is what religion is fundamentally anyway. I won't get into philosophy of religion discussions this morning, but I think that is why it is possible for people to identify as, say, a Christian Buddhist, and to recognize teachings of Jesus while also adopting some of the practices of Buddhism. I think that's also the case because the Buddha never claimed to be divine, and most Buddhists don't see the Buddha as divine, but instead see the Buddha as a great teacher. But there are some traditions that over time stopped talking about the teachings of Buddha and started to focus more on Buddha himself. And I think there are parallels in Christianity where that happened as well, right? Where we stopped talking so much about Jesus' teachings and more focus on Jesus himself. So I think that Buddhism is an incredible tradition. It's incredibly enlightening. And so I give deep thanks for the truths that the Buddha taught and for Buddhists all around the world. Thanks be to God for the Buddhist tradition. Amen.